Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hi there, welcome back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. I'm Dennis Rimmer, and before we get started, just a reminder, if you enjoy our podcast, please click on our Patreon link and maybe give us a hand. It would be much appreciated. Okay, let's get rolling today with, from Saskatoon, Mary Harelkin Bishop, and everybody knows her from the author of the time travel adventures set in Moose Jaw. Hello, Mary. Welcome to Talking Books.
Thank you so much.
Now, you were born in Michigan, apparently, but then some sort of tragic events led you to living or moving up to Canada. Maybe you can relate that a bit for us?
Sure. Yes, I was born in a little town called Hillsdale, Michigan. My dad was from Saskatchewan, actually from a homestead quite close to Langham, and went down to the States and met my mother down there, and so they were married down there, and we lived down there. My mother was killed when I was 9, and she was hit by a drunk driver. Oh. And at that point, everything in my life changed. And I'm the oldest, actually, of 5 kids. So my littlest brother was 2. And there weren't a lot of social groups or social organizations that could help families in crisis at that time. And my family was definitely in crisis. And so my dad packed us up and moved us to Saskatoon, which is where all of my side of the relatives, his side of the relatives, were. So my grandmother and my aunts and my cousins. And he did that, of course, because we all needed help and support.
Exactly. And from there you went to school in Saskatoon, I take it. Which schools did you attend?
So I attended King George School, which is one of the lovely what they call the castle schools, built in 1912, I believe. And I went to high school at Mount Royal Collegiate, and then on to university. Also to SciAst, to Kelsey Institute, the SciAst.
Well, I went to Bedford Road, so there.
Yeah, there always was that rivalry.
And so you and Gordie Howe, 2 famous people that came out of King George.
I would say Gordie Howe was a lot more famous than me, but sure, I'll take that.
Well, maybe he scored more goals than you, but he hasn't written any more books than you have, so there.
No, that's true.
So
I'm famous at McNally.
That's right.
Well, McNally Robinson, yep.
That's a good place to be famous at. So you said you you knew you were going to be a writer when you were 9 or so?
Yes, I started being a writer when I was 9, and I started writing journals or diaries, asking why do bad things happen to people. And from that, I was writing poetry, and really quickly I got into writing stories about a little girl who had a mom and a dad, maybe a dog and a cat, a couple brothers and sisters, and we were always going off on happy family adventures. And of course, it's pretty obvious why I was, living in my imagination, writing stories like that. And it was because I didn't feel like I had the happy ending or the happy life that I wanted to have. And so my stories and my imagination helped me survive a really bad thing that happened. But from that, I realized I had a talent or an ability for writing. One thing that really helped me out was at King George. I had a wonderful teacher whose name was Mrs. Morris, Mrs. Pearl Morris, and she encouraged me with my writing. She took one of my poems and put it on a bulletin board and put all of our class's artwork around it. And she said to me, you're actually a really good writer. And of course, that meant so much to me. The other thing she did in grade 6, and I remember to this day, she read aloud to us every day stories like The Dog Who Wouldn't Be by Farley Mowat. Mrs. Mike was another book she read, and one called Little Britches. So a lot of biographies, stories about homesteading in Saskatchewan, and historical fiction, which really lighted my imagination. And in grade 8, I had a fabulous teacher still at King George School, whose name was Mr. Sparks, Mr. Dave Sparks. And he would tease me about my writing in a really good way, though. He would assign writing for the week to be done at the end of the weekend. My friends would all complain about that, but I just loved it. And if he was asking for 2 or 3 or 4 pages, I was handing in 15 to 20 pages. And Mr. Sparks would say, he would say, "Oh, Mary wrote another novel. I can't go to the hockey game tonight. I have to read that novel." But he would give me ideas and things to do to improve my stories. And so I did know by the time I was heading into high school that writing would be important to me.
Back in my day, I moved here from the West Coast in the mid-'60s. King George had a reputation as a pretty tough school. Was that the way it was when you were there, or is that kind of overblown?
I think that was overblown because I sure don't remember that at all. It was, I guess you would say, like a working class neighborhood. A lot of people who were maybe moving off the farm at the time and coming to live in the city. So there was a lot of that, a lot of cultural diversity in terms of a Polish family across the street from us and a Métis family down the street and other groups, some Russian families around and things like that.
Right, and we're talking with Mary Harelkin Bishop. The Time Travel Tunnels of Moose Jaw, your most well-known works, but it took you a while to come up with those books, apparently from, 20 years or so before they actually blossomed from the time you left high school?
Well, I didn't even know about the tunnels. How Tunnels of Time happened, the very first Tunnels book, was I had I still have 2 kids, but my kids were little at that time. They were maybe grade 6 and 8 or something like that. And we went to Moose Jaw because a woman I know kept saying, "You have to go to Moose Jaw and see the tunnels." And at that time, it was one tunnel tour you could take, not the 2 that you can take now that are kind of bigger and elaborate. The ones you can take now are about 40 to 45 minutes long, whereas this one was about 15 minutes long. And it talked about the gangsters and Capone being in Moose Jaw, and it also talked about the Chinese Canadians living and working in the tunnels. And I was fascinated with this little tunnel tour that we took. I actually dragged my kids through it 3 times in one day. And that's how I got the idea of the stories. And so Tunnels of Time, all of the series, but are historical. I call them historical fiction. They could be called time slip adventures because Andrea, the main character, uses time travel to get into the past, but in each book she goes back into the past to the 1920s and deals with some adventure that's happening.
Now, is there the best time travel book I read, because I haven't read yours, unfortunately, just never have. Don't know why. I've heard about them. I moved here in 2000. I've heard about them since then. And we'll get to the new edition in a moment. Mary Harelkin Bishop is with us, talking about time travel books and many other things. So where was I? My favorite time travel book is 11/23/63 by Stephen King, because he makes it sound so realistic. A guy just steps through a door and there he is. So how does your heroine get back to the 1920s?
So in the first book, she and her family are in the basement of a restaurant, and they're in Moose Jaw for a family wedding, and the restaurant owner is talking about 2 tunnels that he has that are accessed from his restaurant. And so in the one, Andrea and her family kind of go around a corner, and there's a mirror there, and Andrea doesn't really see that mirror, and she crashes into it, and that's how she goes back in time for that one. But in all the other ones, they actually use a magic armoire that becomes like a portal to the past, kind of like the Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe that has the big wardrobe.
That makes more sense than something elaborate like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which is, real good and adventurous, but it's all this hokey, smoky stuff with machines and gadgets and gizmos and whatnot. So I like the fact that if there is such a thing as time travel, and who knows, that it's just something simple. It's that anyone could stumble upon. Now, does she keep it a secret?
She tries to keep it a secret, but in the second one, Tunnels of Terror, her little brother reads her diary and so discovers. So then in the other books, he actually ends up going back with her through that magic portal that they finally discover.
Those nasty little brothers, they're just the worst. Yes.
Yeah, you love them and you hate them.
That's right. So the reason I actually contacted you, I saw a story a while back in Bridges in Saskatoon that you have a sort of a 20th anniversary edition of Tunnels of Time. Mary Harelkin Bishop, tell us about that. How did that come about and why? And you've changed things, I understand. So maybe you can just give us a quick rundown of all of that.
Sure. The first thing I'll say, though, is we did not change the plot.
Good.
I think that's very important for people to know. But Tunnels of Time has been one of the most popular books and a best-selling book in Saskatchewan. It's on the Saskatchewan curriculum. And so when the 20th anniversary was coming up, I actually contacted at the time Coteau Books. And I don't know if you realize now Coteau Books has closed its doors as of January last year.
Yes, I was going to talk about that soon, too.
Yeah. So it was actually slated to come out with Coteau September this year, so September 2020. And so when Coteau closed its books, this book was actually pretty much ready to go. And so I was working with Driver Works Inc. out of Regina. They've published a few of my other books. And so we just took over and continued working with Driver Works with this book. The thing I really like about the new revised edition is that we've shortened the chapters. And that was one thing that teachers everywhere said to me, that the chapters are too long to do a read aloud for like 20 minutes a day. When you look back and look at that book, the chapters are very, very long. And so we shortened the chapters down so that they would make, good read aloud material for teachers. We added 12 illustrations by a wonderful artist named Wendy Nordell out of Alberta. She's done a fabulous job. We updated the cover. It now has what I would call a vortex on it that shows that something's going to happen, and the numbers on the clock of the clock tower in the background are jumping off, going into the vortex. So I think it gives the idea of time travel. We added a historical note, which wasn't there before, as well as questions teachers could ask, and also a Q&A with me, the author.
Well, that's great. And so it was a bit of a scramble, though, to find a new publisher after Coteau, unfortunately, and I don't know how that happened, but it's very sad that it did. So they went under, so you had to... Was it much of a challenge to get a new connection, or did that come about pretty quick?
No, that was pretty quick because, as I said, I've had other books published by Driver Works Inc., and so it was just a matter of talking to them and getting it fit into their slate of things that were being published.
Gotcha. We're talking with Mary Harelkin Bishop, known for the Tunnels of Time, time travel books based in Moose Jaw. So you went there and took your kids through, but you didn't have any other previous connections to Moose Jaw, did you?
Not really, except for it being a place maybe to go spend a weekend. Moose Jaw, let's say back in the late 90s or even early 2000s, was a really quaint little city, almost like a forgotten place, at least in my head. You could walk down Main Street and see all these beautiful buildings, and had the beautiful park just off, about 2 blocks off Main Street. So it was a place that I had been before just to spend a weekend or that kind of thing, but no other real connection to it.
Gotcha. We're talking with Mary Harelkin Bishop. And speaking of young adult books, years ago in the 80s, I interviewed Scott Young, the father of Neil Young, famous author of the Scrubs on Skates books. And he says, yep, that's the pension plan. If you're a Canadian writer, the best thing you can do is have a young adult book. It'll keep being printed for years and years. So I guess you found out that secret in a hurry.
Well, and it is nice in terms of, I guess you could say, a renewable generation every few years. But it is in rural Saskatchewan, in the cities as well, but in rural Saskatchewan, what I notice is teachers read one or two of the books, and the class plans a class trip, and it's their year-end class trip often to go down to the tunnels in Moose Jaw.
That's great. And you also have more than just those. How many books altogether do you have out there?
So if you count the second Tunnels of Time, I have 12 books published. Most of them are young adult or children's books. I did publish a few years ago a book called Moving Forward about our Paralympic athlete Colette Begonia, who lives up now. She was living in Saskatoon. Now she lives up near McDowell and is a skier.
Right.
I have. So yes, 2 books. So Moving Forward, and then another book about her, which is a picture book, because when I published Moving Forward, I had several people say to me, well, you really should do something that's a little bit more accessible for young children. So I wrote the script or the story for a picture book, and then had an artist did some beautiful pictures to go with that. And that one's called Gina's Wheels.
I see. And also, first of all, tell me about your writing routine, because I know you're busy with a day job, quote unquote, but what is your actual writing routine, if indeed you have one?
Right. So my day job, actually, I retired about 3 years ago from working at Saskatoon Public Schools for 30-some years. So mostly my routine for writing is if I'm in the middle of a story, I get up and write in the morning. But if I'm doing things like but promoting and that, then I don't have to be so strident about getting up too early.
And are these characters, are they always bouncing around in your brain, and you're halfway through dinner somewhere and all of a sudden something comes to mind that you just have to make a note of? Is that what happens? Oh,
that's very familiar to me. Yes, that, and keeping a notebook beside my bed so I can get up and, I have a lot of great creative ideas at like 3 a.m, so it happens.
That's right. And you were a literary teacher for a while, is that right? Literacy.
Yes, I was a literacy teacher, and a literacy consultant, all with Saskatoon Public Schools. What I've been doing most recently, since I retired, which I have enjoyed immensely, is working with Saskatoon Travel Council, going out to some of the band schools and helping students out there write about their histories, which has been really a fascinating and wonderful project to be involved in.
Do you find the students they're a bit resistant at first, and then they accept the program and fall in line and like it, or do they like it right away?
It depends on the students. One thing, of course, you have to build relationship and build trust with the students, and so yes, that can take time. And but once the students can see that they can be successful, it's just a beautiful thing to watch.
So what are you working on now? Any new projects coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, I guess the next thing that I'm actually working on right now is Tunnels of Terror is the second book. And so we're looking at revising that and doing not exactly what we did with Tunnels of Time, but just having a new edition come out for that one. And we're hoping for either June 2021 or in the fall of 2021.
And we are with Mary Harelkin Bishop with the Tunnels of Time books, and there's 5. So you don't plan to do any more new ones in that series?
I do have an idea for another Tunnels book. Each of the books either has to do, like Tunnels of Time has to do with Al Capone, And then Tunnels of Terror has to do with the corrupt police force that was in Moose Jaw at the time. So each book has to do with some historical thing that happened. And in November 1928, there was a fire in Moose Jaw that was arson, and the Temple Garden Dance Pavilion, which is a very famous building, burnt to the ground. And they know it was arson because the fire started simultaneously in 3 areas. And so the timing is right, too, in terms of 1920s with my characters, and then having gangsters still around. So, yeah, there's a story that's kind of playing in my head right now that may end up on paper one of these days.
And did Al Capone actually visit Moose Jaw?
You know, for many years I had to say it was all, that there was no documented proof. But 4 years ago, his great niece, Deirdre Capone, wrote a book and talked about him being in Moose Jaw. She actually came to Moose Jaw, was interviewed, and they did a documentary called Finding Al that you can find on YouTube about him being in Moose Jaw, and saying how much he really appreciated and liked small town Saskatchewan.
I guess
so. Yes, there is now proof that he was in Moose Jaw.
And I suppose crossing the border was a lot easier 100 years ago than it is now. I know my grandfather came from eastern Washington, kind of back and forth. So it must have been a bit easier then than it is now.
Oh, very easy. There were lots of stories about Capone hopping on what was called the Sioux Line Railway and taking the railway up to Moose Jaw, because Moose Jaw at that time was one of the biggest railway places in Western Canada. There are also stories that I heard from small towns around Redvers in particular, that would say that Capone would drive his car and then leave it in one of the service stations, basically hiding in one of the stalls in the service station, and then he would hop the train there. And there are also lots of stories of the bootlegging that went on and running the booze over the border back and forth. But yeah, in those days, I mean, there would be no real surveillance except maybe on, main roads and that kind of thing. So I think it'd be very easy to smuggle things back and forth and to get in and out of the country.
Alcohol, it's wonderful. It solves all the problems of the world. Mary Harelkin Bishop, before we wrap it up, I guess you've been asked this a million times, but advice for would-be writers starting out, what is your go-to advice, your elevator pitch for that question?
So I would say read a lot, read in different genres. And when you see something an author has done, a technique that you like, try it out in your own writing. I would also say keep all the things that you're working on. Have an idea file, because you get ideas, as we talked about already, in different places. And so hang on to your ideas, and then you can work them into various stories. Those are my two really, big pieces of advice.
And of course, the key is, how do you write a book? You write it one word at a time. So whether it takes 10 minutes or a day or 10 years to write your book, you just put your butt in the chair, as they say, and pound away. Not that I've done that, but that's what I tell people to do. Not that I'm an expert or anything.
And yes, and be persistent. That's right. Keep at it.
Keep at it. Good words of advice from Mary Harelkin Bishop. Before we wrap it up, if you enjoyed this podcast out there in podcast land, please click on our Patreon link and give us a hand. It's much appreciated. And Mary, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.